Who's scared for anatomy? Right? So let's go back all the way to anatomy and talk blood flow. And let's talk specifically pulmonary blood flow, right? What is pulmonary blood flow? How are we getting the blood? Where's it going? All that wonderful stuff, right? Essentially, pulmonary blood flow is going to begin at the pulmonary artery, right? So just outside of the heart. What part of the heart, though? Well, it's going to be right outside of the right ventricle. And the reason that's coming from the right ventricle is that the right side of the blood is going to be receiving deoxygenated blood or mixed blood that's going to be coming from the body, from the system. It's going to receive that deoxygenated blood or that used blood, right, into the right atria. It's going to flow into the right ventricle. That right ventricle is then going to pump that blood out of the heart and towards the lungs, where it's going to come out of the heart and split and go towards each lung. Once we get to the lung, we're going to circulate through the pulmonary capillaries. It's really going to be in these pulmonary capillaries where the gas exchange is going to be occurring. So it's going to be inside of the lungs, deep in the lungs, along next to the alveoli, where the capillary itself, where the vascular tissue itself is only 2 cells away from the alveoli, right? There's the alveolar cell, its membrane, the capillary cell, its membrane, and they're going to basically be hugging each other and touching each other and ready for site exchange to occur. Once we leave that capillary bed, we're going to circulate that now oxygenated blood and decarbon dioxide, I don't even know how you say that, blood back towards the heart, right, via the pulmonary vein. And then once we reach the pulmonary vein, we're going to pump into the left atria, from the left atria and the left ventricle, from the left ventricle out to the body. So that's simply pulmonary blood flow, right? From the right ventricle to the lungs, lungs to the left atria, to the left ventricle, to the body. Right atria to the right ventricle to the lungs, lungs to the left ventricle, or left atria to the left ventricle to the body. Pulmonary blood flow. Super simple. What is it, though, that makes blood able to carry oxygen? Well, we're going to dissolve some amount of carbon dioxide and some amount of oxygen inside the blood. Not a lot, but we're going to dissolve some. However, the gross majority of oxygen is actually going to be transported on something called hemoglobin. And what hemoglobin is I've got another picture on the next slide for you. Hemoglobin is essentially responsible for binding oxygen. Carbon dioxide is going to be transformed into bicarbonate and transported more stably as bicarbonate. So what is hemoglobin? Well, hemoglobin is just a protein. At the end of the day, it's a protein. It's got a really cool structure that allows for the binding of 4 different oxygen molecules. When hemoglobin binds oxygen, it's called oxyhemoglobin. When it is unbound to oxygen, it's called deoxyhemoglobin. And you can see that there's these kind of like 4 sites. 1, 2, 3, 4, right? These kind of dark gray areas right here, these kind of like outcroppings are going to be where you're going to actually bind the oxygen. Now, this is why carbon monoxide poisoning is so dangerous, right? Carbon monoxide can actually get in and bind these proteins and take up oxygen binding sites so that you almost suffocate because your body is able to bring in the oxygen, but it's not able to offload oxygen or even to bind oxygen inside of the blood. Kind of crazy, right? So oxygen bound hemoglobin is oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve is talking about how do we offload oxygen from hemoglobin? How do we get oxyhemoglobin and turn it into deoxyhemoglobin? And where are the sites at which we're doing that? Essentially, what the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve is going to be signaling is a quantitative relationship between partial pressures of oxygen and binding affinity of oxygen to hemoglobin. So how likely the oxygen is to be bound to hemoglobin at various partial pressures or at various oxygen pressures. How likely is it that oxygen is going to be bound to hemoglobin? If the partial pressure changes, then it's going to facilitate one or the other. It's going to facilitate offloading or onboarding, if you will. It's going to facilitate binding or offloading of the oxygen molecule. It's going to be predominantly determined by the PO2 of the blood, but it can also be manipulated based on the affinity of the hemoglobin for that molecule of oxygen. And we know that we can manipulate protein affinity for things and enzyme affinity for things by altering the pH of the system as well as the temperature of the system. So, in general, a high partial pressure of oxygen is going to favor oxygen loading, going to favor oxygen binding to hemoglobin. The lower that partial pressure of oxygen gets, the more likely we are to unload that oxygen and get rid of it. So this is what the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve looks like, right? Oh my gosh, this looks terrible right here. I apologize. It's not oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Should be one word. So here you can see that it's a sigmoidal shaped curve, right? So there's a flat part at the top and it actually starts to flatten out again down here. And up here at the top side of this is saying that 100% of oxygen is bound to hemoglobin, 80% of oxygen is bound to hemoglobin, 60%, 40%, 20%, 0%, right? And then this is going to be the volume of oxygen unloaded to the tissue. You can't really tell because it's a bad picture, but this is going to be the partial pressure of oxygen down here. So at a partial pressure of 100, we're going to have 100% saturation of hemoglobin. At 80, we're still pretty close to 100. As we drop that partial pressure, we start seeing that we're favoring unloading and unloading and unloading and unloading. So you can see that at about 40, this is going to be the partial pressure of the tissues, and we're going to be unloading oxygen to the tissue. Now, let's look at a little bit cleaner of a picture here. So this blue is going to be a normal oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, right? So we're going to be at a high PO2, we have high levels of saturation. As we drop that PO2, we're going to drop the level of saturation. This is going to be at the lung. This is going to be at the tissue. This is going to be at the lung. This is going to be at the working muscle, right? So we're going to, through the system, we're going to decrease the partial pressure of oxygen. As we decrease the partial pressure of oxygen through the system, we're going to be favoring offloading. And that allows us to target offload oxygen at the site where we need it most, right? If we adjust the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve by adjusting the pH or the temperature, we're going to have either leftward or rightward shifts of that curve. So we can either increase the loading or increase the unloading of the curve. So if let's say that we decrease blood pH, let's say that we actually increase the acidity or make it more acid-like, we're going to actually shift to the right. And that's what's going to be represented by this red line here. So this is a rightward shift or a Bohr effect shift. And that's going to be due to an increase in acidity or an increase in hydrogen ion concentrations or a decrease in pH. All are saying the same thing. So as we shift to the right, what's going to happen is we're going to favor offloading of the oxygen from hemoglobin, because while here we might be, you can already tell that we're decreased some. So at 100 PO2, we're a little bit less than 100% saturation. But we actually start unloading earlier as we're moving to as we're decreasing partial pressures, right? Again, let's say that this would be 100 right here. This would be 90, 80, 70, right? As we move down in partial pressures, we actually favor unloading faster with a change in pH, a decrease in pH. Now, temperature is going to do the same thing. As we increase temperature, we're going to shift to the right. However, if we decrease temperature, we're going to actually shift to the left. So we can actually favor onloading or not favor offloading. We can actually hold on to hemoglobin, or we can actually get oxygen to hold on to hemoglobin longer by trying to maintain it on, or by decreasing the body temperature. What's interesting here is what happens when we exercise. When we exercise, our muscles start working more, right? We know this. What does our muscle, What does our working muscle need? It needs oxygen in order to go through oxidative phosphorylation, right? In order to grab that last electron and to make sure that we're continuing to work the electron transport chain. Well, if we need to make sure that we're getting oxygen to working muscle faster, are we going to want to favor offloading or onloading or offloading or binding of hemoglobin with oxygen? We're going to want to favor offloading at the muscle that's working. One of the side effects of exercise is an increase in temperature. So if we increase the temperature, what happens? We're also going to favor offloading and not binding hemoglobin with oxygen. So we're going to be able to facilitate greater oxygen release at the target tissue, at the working muscle. Because if we weren't able to supply that oxygen, then we wouldn't be able to supply the ATP that's needed to provide the work rate that's hoped for, right? So while we have a oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, that's important because it's occurring inside of the blood. Inside of the muscle, we don't have capillaries. We don't have blood flow inside of the muscle tissue itself, right? So we have to have a different transport mechanism when we get oxygen to the tissue level, when we get oxygen to that working muscle. So we're favoring offloading it, and we're getting rid of oxygen off of hemoglobin into the tissue, and then we're putting it onto myoglobin, right? So myoglobin is an oxygen-binding protein that's found inside of the muscle. And its goal is to move oxygen from a cell membrane into the mitochondria, which is where the oxidative phosphorylation is going to be occurring. It's similar to hemoglobin. It's less big, but it's similar to hemoglobin, and so it works in a very similar manner. However, it will actually favor holding on to oxygen longer than hemoglobin will, but then that means that it will actually discharge its oxygen at a much lower O2 percentage. So it actually has a different curve shape. So the reason that it's going to be doing this is active muscle is going to be decreasing the PO2, right? Just because there's a decreasing PO2 doesn't necessarily mean that that's where the oxygen needs to get to. It could need to get to a different muscle. It needs to get to the muscles that are going to be working the hardest and working the most. So they're going to have the lowest PO2. If we allowed for oxygen delivery, if we allowed for oxygen unloading at high PO2s with myoglobin, then we would never get oxygen to the site that needs it most. But by holding on to that oxygen tighter, we can actually kind of cherry pick who it's going to, who that oxygen's going to, by holding on to it and holding it tight. Does that make sense? So enough talking about oxygen, right? Let's talk about carbon dioxide. Well, carbon dioxide is going to be transported in the blood, similar to oxygen, right? The mainly similarity is that it's transported in the blood. We're going to have some CO2 that can actually be carried on a red blood cell, but not a whole bunch. The majority of it is actually going to be transported as the form of bicarbonate, right? So it's going to be dissolved into the plasma. By transporting the CO2 in blood, we're able to get that CO2 back towards the lungs. When that CO2 gets to the lungs, it's going to be in a higher concentration in the plasma than it is in the lungs, right? It's going to be high in the plasma and low in the lungs. So we're going to actually have a diffusion of CO2 out of the blood and into the lungs. So we're going to actually offload CO2 out of the blood and into the lungs so that we can exhale the CO2 out. So one of the big things that we'll talk about later on in the semester as we're talking about acid-base balance, I think it's actually next week, is that pulmonary ventilation is really largely responsible for not just bringing oxygen in, but also blowing off excess hydrogen ions, controlling the acid level within the body, and removing the CO2. So one of the primary reasons that we're actually going to hyperventilate after exercise is that we're trying to get rid of acid. We're trying to get rid of hydrogen ions, which are going to be creating an acid level, and we're going to try to get rid of CO2. Kind of neat, and we'll talk about that again. Just kind of quick teaser. It's out there for you. We'll talk about it this next week. So what happens when we transition to exercise? We know that we have to have oxygen in our body. We know that ventilation occurs to bring oxygen in and to get CO2 out. We know that we have all these different zones of respiration and cardiorespiratory. Like, we get it. What happens when we transition to exercise? Well, if you look at this graph, you can see that ventilation is going to dramatically increase. It is abrupt and it is sharp. You start exercise, your ventilation increases. Boom, right? Like it is charged and ready to go. As soon as you start exercising, your ventilation is going to start taking off. Interestingly, you can see that there's a very slight dip in partial pressure of oxygen, and there's a very slight increase in carbon dioxide. Realistically, these are not occurring at high levels. There's not a big dip that's occurring in oxygen. We're not going without oxygen. Again, it's not like we're overproducing CO2 and we're not able to buffer it or get rid of it, right? Essentially, it's a blip in the radar, and then it's gone and we're flatlining. So the primary thing that's happening in the transition to exercise is this increase in ventilation that's occurring almost instantaneously. Something that I want to point out is that this change in ventilation is abrupt and then plateaus simply because this is representing steady state exercise. If this was non-steady state exercise or it was graded exercise, this ventilation plateau would not be occurring. So what about when we exercise in a hot, humid environment? We already know that we start seeing changes in plasma volume, right? We talked about that last week. We start seeing evaporative sweat losses, so we change our plasma volume. What happens to our respiration? What happens to our ventilation as we're exercising in a hot, humid environment? Well, over here on the right-hand side, you can see that generally there's not much of a ventilation shift. There is somewhat of an upward ventilation shift, but not a ton. However, as we're exercising in a hot, humid environment, which are going to be these closed squares, you can see that there's actually a slow drift upwards that's going to occur as we're increasing in duration and as we're increasing in heat, right? And the reason for this is most likely due to an increase in temperature of the blood. And so what happens if we increase the temperature of the blood? We're going to shift that curve to the right, and we're going to favor offloading. If we're favoring offloading, then it might not be that we're getting oxygen to all the places that we need. So we actually have to ventilate more in order to make sure that we're holding on to more oxygen inside of our blood. And you can see that it's up here at the top. It's not really that there's a major change in carbon dioxide, right? Like we're not changing the amount of carbon dioxide that's inside of us. We're not changing how much work we're completing or how much effort we're exerting or how much carbon dioxide we're producing necessarily. Instead, it seems to be that it is just due to the oxygen. It's just due to the ventilation. It's just due to the fact that we're trying to bring in oxygen and not necessarily blow off carbon dioxide. Kind of interesting. Now, what about incremental exercise? Right? Remember I showed you a couple slides ago that there was a plateauing after the rest of work transition, and that was with steady state. Now, if we're looking at non-steady state or incremental or graded exercise, you can see that as we increase the work rate, we're not going to be giving ourselves, like this could be increase steady state, right? We're just graphing the change in work rate with the change in ventilation. So as you can see, as work rate increases, ventilation increases. As work rate increases, we need more oxygen to fuel our work. And so we need to bring in more oxygen. So we need to ventilate more. We need to breathe more in order to bring in that oxygen. As we work harder and harder and harder, we increase linearly, right? So to go from 20 to 40, it's pretty much a straight line. 40 to 60, pretty much a straight line. However, at some point, our ventilation actually goes from linear to nonlinear. Linear to essentially an exponential increase in ventilation. What is it that is causing this? Well, one of the primary things that's going to be causing this is we're going to switch from ventilating to bring in oxygen to ventilating to blow off CO2, right? Like we'll actually start hitting this hyperventilatory level. And this inflection point is going to be called ventilatory threshold. Some people will actually use ventilatory threshold as a proxy measure of lactate threshold. Is it completely accurate? No, but can you get away with it? Definitely, 100%. By now, it should be pretty clear that ventilation changes a lot, right? Like we can change ventilation pretty often and pretty frequently, and it has large impact on the exercise that we're doing and why we're ventilating, right? Like if we need to supply more oxygen, then we got to increase ventilation. If we need to blow off more CO2, we got to increase ventilation. It's a motion, or it's a system that needs fine tuning. So in order to control that fine tuning, we're going to have multiple levels of ventilatory control. One of the primary levels at rest, one of the primary things at rest is going to be coming from the brain. And it's going to be coming specifically from the medulla oblongata. If you haven't seen Waterboy, you need to see it. You'll never be able to see that word without thinking of alligators and toothbrushes. Watch the movie. Essentially, at rest, we're going to have almost exclusive control of the diaphragm via somatic nerve endings, and they're going to go from the brainstem into the diaphragm. And if you remember, inspiration and expiration at rest is largely going to be a diaphragmatic process. It's going to be an active contraction of the diaphragm and then passive relaxation of the diaphragm that's going to be controlling ventilation at rest. That ventilatory control is going to be held in the ventilation control center, the respiratory control center, which is located inside of that medulla. And specifically, there's going to be a couple of clusters of neurons. I don't care if you know the specific names or any of that, but they're going to be controlling the rate and the depth at which we breathe. At rest, the major rhythm of breathing is going to be determined by inspiratory neurons. So they're going to be driving inspiration. We're going to be driving that inspiration based on neural and humoral chemoreceptors. So we're actually going to be manipulating breathing rate based on neural inputs, as well as what the blood is telling our brain and what the blood is saying is going on inside of the body. So neural, it makes sense with the brain, right? What about humoral? What are blood signals that can be signaling that we need to breathe? Well, we have a couple of really interesting chemoreceptors. One, we have carotid body chemoreceptors, and the carotid body sits inside the carotid artery. And now the carotid artery is going to be responsible for providing blood. I'm doing this because it sits right in here. It's going to be providing blood to the brain. All right, the jugular vein is going to be bringing blood away from the brain. Carotid artery is going to be supplying blood to the brain. So we know that our body needs oxygen. Just like our body needs oxygen, your brain needs oxygen. Just like if someone chokes you, you will pass out. It's a preservative mechanism. If you have a deficit that's sensitive to the carotid, then your brain is going to recognize that it needs to change its breathing rate of the body, because there's a sensory organ that's basically telling the brain, hey, we need to adjust how much oxygen we have here. Now the other one is going to be the aortic bodies. These are going to sit in the aorta, and now the aorta is going to be responsible for pumping blood to the rest of the body. And it's important to know how much oxygen is being pumped to the body. And since it's coming out of the heart and straight through the aorta, it's a great chance to be grabbing chemical messengers about what is going on in the body for the brain. Neural chemoreceptors, or these kind of neural impulse centers, they make sense for the brain. It's going to be higher brain centers actually telling the medulla that it is doing exercise, right? So there is an overflow of neural signal that is going to specifically come from the motor cortex. So the part of the brain that's telling our body, hey, we need to do muscle contraction, is actually going to have an overflow of neural input that goes into the medulla oblongata. And that overflow will basically signal the medulla, hey, there is exercise going on. There is muscular contraction going on. We need to actually increase our breathing rate to match the level of muscle contraction that's occurring so that we can actually feel this exercise. Kind of cool. What's going on with ventilation as we increase in intensity of exercise? How are we going to use our fine-tuning mechanisms to adjust ventilation with moderate intensity exercise? Well, we're going to have those higher brain centers telling our body, or telling our medulla, hey, listen, we have muscle contraction going on here. We need to increase ventilation to match this muscle contraction. We're also going to have those humoral chemoreceptors. So we're going to have the carotid body and we're going to have the aortic bodies telling our brain, hey, listen, we need to increase ventilation because we're sensing a decrease in oxygen. We're sensing an increase in carbon dioxide, and we're sensing a decrease in oxygen. As that increases in duration, you're going to start to see that ventilation rate continue to increase and increase and increase. Now, what about during heavy exercise? Well, you're going to have all those similar mechanisms from moderate intensity exercise, but you're also going to be able to have one more level, and you're going to really start to have higher levels of blood signaling molecules. So you're going to have higher levels of potassium that are going to be released from the body, and you're also going to have a change in blood temperature and a change in catecholamine presence. Every single one of those things is going to be sensed and cause an increase in ventilation. In general, what we're looking at here is that ventilation is going to increase with exercise. Ventilation increases are going to be determined by changes in oxygen and carbon dioxide. And then we're going to kind of manipulate those changes in oxygen and carbon dioxide levels inside of the blood based on pH of the blood, based on pH of the body, based on temperature of the blood, based on temperature of the body. Exercise is going to be able to manipulate that pH and manipulate that temperature. And because of that manipulation, we're going to have to manipulate our ventilation, right? It makes sense. Now, what happens when we get to the absolute highest level of human performance, right? What happens when we get all the way to the peak human performance? If we think about how this system works, essentially, we have our heart contracts and it pumps blood to our lungs. Our lungs have a gas exchange that happens, and then that blood is instant. It is just passing through. It's not like it's being held in the lungs, right? It is passing through capillaries and returning back to the heart. So there is blood constantly flowing past the lungs, through the lungs and past the lungs, through the lungs and past the lungs. There's no holding reserve for it there. So as we increase in intensity in exercise, we're going to have continual increases in heart rate. If we have a continual increase in heart rate, we have continuous increases in blood flow rate through the lungs. Is it possible that our pulmonary system will actually limit human performance? So there's been talk that it could be possible for the absolute highest of high athletes, and even still, it's still very new research, showing that the speed at which that blood is flowing past the lungs might actually be causing decreases in human performance. So because the speed is so fast as it's going, that blood's passing through the lungs, we're not actually able to onload and offload oxygen and carbon dioxide as much as we need to in order to continually match the performance level or the work output that we're trying to have. In general, no, the pulmonary system's not going to limit performance. Is there going to be nuances? Yes, of course. But it's in general, it's not going to be that specific aspect of the pulmonary system. Now, there is certain disease states that have pulmonary system muscle fatigue, so that the muscles that are associated with breathing, your diaphragm, your internal, external intercostals, your abdominal muscles, all those things that actually control the rate at which we're breathing and the forcefulness with which we're ventilating. There's disease states that can have fatigue of that, and that would limit your performance. But in general, the pulmonary system is not going to be the primary limiter of sports performance or human performance. Awesome. Thanks for another great week. Next week, we should be talking about acid-base balance, and all of that is going to tie back into the ventilation stuff.